with some instructions first. Thank you everyone for joining us on this call. You will see a Q&A button on your screen if you poke around the controls. That's how we're keen to get questions from you, and we will attempt to pick up and answer as many as we can as we're going through. I can't promise we'll get to all of them. Usually we don't, but we will indeed have a go at it, and we'll try and respond to ones that we can't answer during the course of this webinar by email later. So it's worth asking. We have people from all around the world, we have Marshall Mermel from Cold Spring, New York, for example, and we have a friend from Tokyo. So this is very much a global audience. This is a part of the Climate Bonds Initiative webinar series on the EU Taxonomy, talks with TEG experts. Today, we're going to talk about adaptation and resilience. Now, there's a couple of things you need to understand about adaptation and resilience. When we started with the technical working groups, technical expert groups work on this, we had a brief to look at climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and to look at the impacts on a number of other areas such as circular economy and pollution prevention. We're now in the middle of a crisis, which is really forcing us to think even more creatively about what we have to do about adaptation and resilience. We need to understand this crisis as a crisis with its roots in environmental degradation. Pathogens jump species when ecosystems are degraded, and there's been a number of very interesting papers in the last few weeks about this. This is not separate, entirely different from what's happening to our planet's environment and climate. It is absolutely part of the story. We have been told by the World Health Organization and the IPCC's Health Committee for 20 years now that under the kind of climate change we are looking at experiencing now, +2-degree temperatures and higher, we can expect a century of pandemics, as well as a century of different kinds of shocks, whether they be firestorms like Australia experienced over the Christmas period, or whether they be increased storm surges of typhoons in East Asia expected to be 3 times as intense, or simply the changing in rainfall patterns as things come as dumps and wash away hills and favelas, and then there's drought, as distinct from more smooth rainfall. These are significant things that will impact on our agricultural systems, on our economies and our cities. Think Hurricane Sandy in New York, but think that on steroids to understand what we're going to experience this century. Resilience is absolutely critical. Adaptation to what we know is coming is absolutely critical. So I'm hoping that this year, through this experience, we're going to start thinking about this. Yes, it is the resilience of our health systems, the depth that we have to be able to deal with big shocks that hit our societies and our people. Yes, it is the resilience of our social protection systems, because we do need to help the poor when these happens, the people like in America and Europe who have been in cafe jobs and suddenly have nothing to fall back on, unless we want to consign ourselves to disaster and increased disaster. But of course, what we're starting with is what's in the taxonomy, which focuses on a broader issue of adaptation resilience, and also adaptation resilience of the mitigation components that we've already outlined in previous webinars. This series will keep on going until June. We have next week transport. It's on a Thursday, 1500 Paris time every week. You can find past webinars and podcasts of those webinars available from climatebonds.net/webinars, or just go to Spotify or Apple or Google, look for your podcasts. Today, we're joined by Anna Creed, who's Head of Standards, the Climate Bonds Initiative, and Cinzia Losenno. A misspelling of a name, it's L-O-S-E-N-N-O. I'm sorry, we will fix that before we go out, our era, of the European Investment Bank, who have been looking at this issue, been the co-chairs of the adaptation group at the EU Technical Expert Group level. Anna has a long history on terrestrial carbon and terrestrial issues in science before joining the Climate Bonds Initiative some years ago, and Cinzia has a long history too. She was the Asian Development Bank in a similar role where I met her some 8 or 10 years ago, working on water adaptation projects around the world, and now she's doing it in the European Investment Bank. We're very lucky to have them today. So what I'd like to do, Anna, is to ask you to kick off with giving us the essentials that people need to know about the adaptation and resilience provisions of the EU taxonomy? You're on mute, Anna, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Sean, and hello, good morning and afternoon, everybody on the call. Yeah, so these first few slides are just introductory, just recapping what Sean said. So what the TEG were asked to do was to determine these screening criteria for 6 environmental objectives. The first one, well, one of them being climate mitigation, adaptation, water management, pollution and prevention control, circular economy and healthy ecosystems. The way that therefore it works is that you are eligible with the requirements of the taxonomy if you make a substantial contribution to one of these goals, at least one of these goals, and you do no significant harm in respect of the other goals. So tailoring this for adaptation resilience, we actually have 2 sets of adaptation and resilience criteria. One is criteria to determine when you're making a substantial contribution to climate change adaptation and resilience, and the other is when you're doing no significant harm to climate change adaptation and resilience. Cinzia is going to talk in more detail after me about those actual criteria. I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction to the framing of them in a sense. First of all, they cover, Sean, can you flick to the slide with the table?
Thank you. Sorry to be a bit slow off the mark. Thank you, Anna.
That's all right. And the next one as well. All right, I've done 2 in 1. Thank you. Yeah, they cover basically physical climate risks. So when we talk about climate adaptation and resilience, we want to make sure things are adapted and resilient to physical climate risks. Like Sean says, obviously there's a whole different ball game going on at the moment about rebuilding resilient societies that are socio-economic resilient, essentially, in response to COVID and other pandemics that may or will come. This, therefore, is a key part of the start of that work, really focusing on the aspect of the physical climate risk, not so much on the broader social and economic implications of those risks. So, therefore, one of the first things that we did was to put some boundaries around that in a way to make it easier for users to determine what they need to be assessing risks in relation to. And so this is a schematic, in a sense, of the types of risks that we're talking about for assessing climate adaptation and resilience. So they cut into acute and chronic. So this covers things which are slowly accumulating over time and which are happening much more suddenly and much more violently at any point in time. And they cover sort of 4 key areas. So risk relating to changing temperature, to change in wind patterns, to change in water patterns and availability, and to change in land movement or stability or quality of the land base, basically those kind of things. The reason this is important is because the criteria themselves are process-based. The point being that which of these risks that you're exposed to really depends on your location, on the nature of your assets, your economic activities, and therefore it's not possible. We were asked as sort of an adaptation group within the TEG to, in a sense, come up with a white list of these are the investments in adaptation and resilience. And if you invest in these things, you're making a substantial contribution to adaptation and resilience. And it's not really possible to do that because the investments that you need to make are very tailored to your specific circumstance. They're tailored to whether you're exposed to the risk of sea level rise or whether you're exposed to drought or flood, and whether a flood or a drought is actually going to make a significant impact on your business operations. So Cinzia will talk about how we've reflected that in the criteria, but the key point of that is that the criteria are process-based. Sean, could you flick on to the next slide for me?
Sure. I wanted to ask you, Anna, I mean, this is potentially very complicated, right? There's a lot of moving parts, particularly if you've got an asset by a coast or things. Is the data there for people to be able to make assessments now? How advanced is the assessment industry in this area?
I think there's emerging data out there. It's one thing that is challenging is moving from the sort of high level global climate change scenarios of these things are likely to happen to the much more granular level of what's going to happen in my location, what's the level of extreme risks I need to be thinking about. And also because we really want people to be mindful of the need to be flexible. We're not certain about what these risks are, how extreme these events will be, when they're going to happen, how they're going to play out. So actually a lot of these kind of risk assessments that we're talking about really can you anticipate what you're likely to be your extreme risks and deliver flexible responses to those risks? It is challenging, but I think this is becoming more and more visible, is a need to do. And so the situation, I think, is continually improving around that. There's a lot more tools out there. There's people who are more specialized at these kind of assessments to help here. Cinzia, anything to add on that one?
You're doing this, the EIB, all the time, right?
Yes. No, Anna, I think what I would say is that we are especially in a much better place now than we were perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, where it was really difficult to find the data that would be relevant at the sort of business operation level. So today's climate data is much more available, is much more accessible, is actually much more accurate as well than it used to be, and can be used to really inform decision at that level of granularity. But it comes with a high level of uncertainty too. So people making decisions and people making investment decisions need to be able to understand those uncertainties and deal with them. And there are ways, there are techniques to do that.
Okay, you're gonna take us into that in a minute, but my apologies, Anna, I interrupted your flow. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. So I was just going to say as a final point on this slide is, because this is process-based, because it's very context and location specific, the good news about all of that, yes, the criteria look complicated, but once you've got your head around them, it's the same criteria regardless of the activity. The way you apply it might be different, but the things that you need to do, the steps that you need to take, the things you need to be looking out for are the same regardless of whether we're talking about transportation assets or investments or buildings or manufacturing, et cetera, So it might be a learning curve, but then it's a repetitive process to apply the same thing to different types of assets or activities or sectors.
So you're saying the key thing here is at least to be asking, being informed as much as you can, and then taking action based on what you can find out. That's what you're saying?
That's a very high level summary of the criteria, yes.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
And then just to help people a bit, although we can't give this kind of white list of these adaptation activities, and if you do that, you can count it as an adaptation investment. You need to do your checking on it. But we have tried to help here by outlining two types of adaptation investments. One is investments or actions to adapt an economic activity. And that is really the point that we really need all assets and economic activities to be resilient to climate change. And this is why everything is it's very broad and it needs to be applied across all sectors. We need power stations to be resilient to climate change. We need water supplies to be resilient. Excuse me. We need agriculture to be resilient. We need rail networks to be resilient. If these things go down in a climate crisis, people are going to suffer and economies are going to suffer. So adapted economic activities is really just making all and any economic asset or activity resilient to climate change, which means reducing all their material, physical climate risks, which Cinzia will talk about a bit more.
So we've got some practical things happening already around the world, haven't we? I mean, I talked about pandemics, of course, as one area, but we see sea level rising affecting some places. I mean, I know the road between, is it Santa Marta and Barranquilla in Colombia, has been washed away because they're unusually high sea level rises in that slice of the Caribbean, or at least that's what I was told when I was at a conference in Cartagena. And we're seeing storm surge and increased storm surge and cyclones moving into the Mumbai area. So Mumbai is now becoming a cyclone zone. It wasn't before. This is happening now, right? This is not theoretical.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the point. So going off topic a little bit here, but when we at CBI have certified bonds that relate to resilience, because a lot of the initial contact is with treasurers, they're like, whoa, what are you asking me to do here? But actually we say, well, go to your technical experts, go to the people that do environmental impact assessments, go to the people on the ground who have to decide if this is a good or bad idea, what environmental impacts it's going to have in both directions. They will already have done a lot of this stuff. And I think this is an important point. None of these requirements, hopefully, in an ideal world, we don't want these requirements done just because you want to tag your financing as green or sustainable. You need to do it when you're building or planning your assets and your activities. because it will affect the viability of those assets and activities over time. So we don't want you building houses in a floodplain. If you really have to, we want you to build some contingency in at the beginning, whatever that is, to protect them against flood. So it's really about looking for the evidence that that has been done in a really robust way, not about creating a new, this is what is always, I think, slightly interesting about adaptation resilience. The mitigation is a global good. The direct benefit to you, aside from carbon taxes, etc., can be very remote. Adaptation resilient, the benefits are not remote. Doing this stuff benefits you and as an asset owner, essentially a real asset owner. So I think a lot of this stuff does already happen. It's just trying to pull all that information out of the departments where it is happening, strengthen it, make it more robust, and like Cinzia and I both said, making sure that it's not just looking at the situation today, but it's looking at what the situation might be next week, next year, 5 years, 10 years, etc. And there's flexibility in your responses to that, but it's nothing new in the sense of you do need to be thinking about this stuff and it will benefit you, not just so you can tag your investment as green, but so you can keep operating in essence.
Cinzia, when you were at the ADB, I remember that you were doing things like making loans to water infrastructure projects in Central Asia, which are going to be water stressed in the future. I mean, what tools, how does this work? What tools are you using to make calls on what they should do?
Well, in that particular case, so in the Asian Development Bank at that time, so I'm talking about maybe a few years ago already, there was an effort to develop just a business process to systematically screen your projects and identify the risks that your project, your operation, whatever that might be, whatever sector that might be, could be affected as a result of a changing climate. And the intention there was really to ensure that whatever the Asian Development Bank was financing would be performing well, even under a changing climate. And I think the Asian Development Bank was one of the banks that moved very early on that type of approach. So really systematically trying to understand how their operations would be affected. Because of the location of where they are, the ADB is based in Manila. Manila is a highly vulnerable city. It's affected by typhoons constantly, and the frequency, the intensity of these typhoons continue to increase. It's not any longer a few months season. The typhoon season is extended and has become 2/3 of the year. It used to be maybe a third, half of the year. The number of typhoons is just mind-blowing. It's in the range of the 30, 40 typhoons a year. It's just, it was a need. It was really absolutely clear at that time in the ADB that Asia was going to be hugely affected by the negative effects of climate change, and that if ADB wanted to play a key role as a development bank to really promote prosperity in the region, resilience was absolutely key, essential to its operations. And if I can make a comparison to where I am now, I think the thought process was absolutely the same in the European Investment Bank, except of course that the focus is different. The focus is very much Europe, which is a very different environment from Asia, a very different level of vulnerabilities. But over the years, what we're seeing is that even areas of the world like Europe, that historically had always been perceived as strong, as very well prepared to cope with crisis. Well, actually, it turns out that we are quite vulnerable as well, and it's a much more complex picture because of the differences between the north of Europe and the south of Europe, and the east and the west, and even within countries themselves, and the very highly regulated environment within which we operate. So it's a very different setting, but the need is pretty much the same. It's about really making sure that the investment decisions that we take today are going to make sense of the scope of time they're meant to be performing within. So the next 20, 30 years time. And this is a critical decade, Sean. This is really something that must be done now, today, as we talk. It's not something that can be postponed any longer. We have a very short window, as the scientists tell us, and we really need to adapt.
So these are, you alluded earlier to the business aspect, these are actually issues about whether the investment is going to perform. Effectively, these are credit issues. This is a bit like another layer, because our credit horizon understanding is generally short. We look, forward 5 years or to the past. we're just missing out on something that's actually going to affect whether an asset's going to be able to perform. You build a dam, you want to make sure it can keep working. And I think that's the thing people haven't understood about this. This is about making sure you get returns over the period of time. If you're going to invest in something, it's not an extra environmental aid. It's integral to whether the thing's viable, right?
It's just good business sense. Yeah, it makes really good business sense.
Okay, so people need to understand that. And that applies to bigger projects, of course. Does that apply to the residential home? So, you know, Anna, if you're going to be buying a house in Guildford, for example, does it apply at that level? How do you make this work there?
I think it does, because even in the UK, we see people having trouble insuring their homes now if they're continually subject to severe floods. If you can't insure your home, you're going to have trouble getting a mortgage on it, which means you're going to have trouble selling your property to somebody else who's going to be a bit wiser 5 years down the line than you were 5 years ago when you bought it and these things weren't happening. So I think it is going to make a difference to potentially the availability of insurance, and then potentially the availability of mortgages. And then you're stuck with an asset and a house that you can't live in because it's flooded frequently, expensive repairs that you can't get insurance for, and you can't move either. So it could potentially have quite extreme impacts even in that smaller scale. Yeah.
This should be being dealt with by governments and their planning laws, shouldn't it? Really. That's
what I said about floodplains earlier. The number of houses in the UK that are built on floodplains is quite terrifying when we actually do have other choices sometimes. So yes, I think planning and a sort of, not organisation, what's the word, but a much more kind of coordinated, optimised response to some of these things is really critical for planning of where you put things, for water management, to make sure water allocation across all the different households and industries that use water, agriculture, heavy industries, and power generation, really heavy water users. The use of that water and the shared allocation of that water is a regulatory issue. And it really depends on those structures being in place to make sure that individual operators have a kind of a rule set of parameters to work within to ensure that everything is ticking over together. Yeah.
So ideally, government jurisdictions or municipalities ought to be picking up many of the planning issues. And the insurance industry has published a lot about the responsibility of government to address these issues in terms of looking at liabilities. Mm-hmm. In some places, like Florida, the government has decided to entirely ignore the reinsurance industry, and they've set up their own coastal property reinsurance organisation, which has led to a downgrading of Florida's debt because Florida citizens are taking on risks the private sector won't take on anymore. Mm. Mar-a-Lago, for example, is in a very high risk area when it comes to flooding because of increased intensity of hurricanes. And I don't know what their reinsurance is, but I have a hunch it's probably picked up by the Florida taxpayer rather than by Lloyd's of London. Yeah. So the insurance industry is moving on this, but of course we do need to ensure that we make this an issue for our governments. You know, UK has a different model to Scotland. Scotland, you don't build on floodplains, and in Europe you have that same sort of patchwork quilt of some governments are doing the good things, some things aren't. Cinzia, in terms of your assessment about individual projects and assets, how granular is the information you have about the underlying governance framework to address adaptation and resilience? And do you simply take that into account and accept that, or do you do your own assessment in the Po Valley or in the Rhine about the risks, whatever the local jurisdictions are saying in terms of regulation?
This is a crucial point, and this is one of the key barriers to adaptation. So I'm glad you raised it, and please stop me if I get a bit too technical here. But what we do in the European Investment Bank is to do assessments at the project level, and we treat every project as a special case because of the specificity of the risks associated with each project, the different contexts within the projects take place, the different regulatory environments, whether you are in the Po Valley, you know, or whether you're in the southeast of France or in Finland, or so on and so forth. So each project is very unique in that respect. It requires an understanding that is very granular. Now, there are two key barriers to that. One we already mentioned earlier, which is the data issue. Can you get data to that level of details? In some cases you can, in other cases you have to be a bit creative in how you go about it. But fundamentally, you know, these days there are ways you can handle that. And the other aspect, as we're discussing now, is the regulatory environment. And issues of planning come into place, of course, and that often becomes quite difficult to discuss with the project promoter But we have to do that, and we have to clarify and justify why certain things cannot be done any longer, certain types of investments cannot be done any longer. And then there's another issue, and this is where you need to stop me if I get too technical.
Please go ahead.
Which is to do with the engineering codes, okay? And so the building codes, engineering standards, which even in a very advanced continent like Europe, basically on average are stuck in the 60s and the 70s. So they're based on historical data and based on the assumption that the past is a good representation of the future. And unfortunately, that no longer stands. So what that means is that when we have a discussion really at practical level with the project promoter wanting to build an asset, we require them to go well beyond what's required by their legislation, their engineering standards, because we want them to look at the future. We want to take that forward approach and understand how their asset might perform over the economic life of the investment. This is an area that where we really need to move on at the EU level, certainly, but at the national levels as well around the world. And it's incredibly difficult yet. So this is for us, for the European Investment Bank, possibly the next frontier is where we really want to push the boundaries. Now that thanks to things like the EU taxonomy, we have clarity as what we mean by investments that really contribute to adaptation and resilience.
So we've got to catch up on mitigation, where our energy policies are not consistent with our new emission reduction targets. And we've also got to catch up on revamping all our rules, regulation, and technical standards to deal with what is a rapidly changing climate, right? So a lot of work to be done. Anna, you were talking about adapting economic activity and enabling activity. Did you want to add more to that? I cut you off, I'm sorry.
I do actually. No. It's something you said a couple of minutes ago, which I think is probably something to bring out about these criteria, which is there is, even within adapted economic, I'm going to say this very quickly, so otherwise I'm going to jump into what Cinzia was going to say later, but even within adapted economic activities, we do have this concept within the criteria that it's not just that you are making your activity adapted. We also want to make sure that you are not causing maladaptation for anybody else. And I think this is something really important, that even if people are thinking about their own economic returns, that still isn't enough for us. We don't want you to be protecting your economic returns at the expense of somebody else's is captured. So to create this externality problem that we've got with mitigation and all sorts of other things. So, and that is where I think sometimes our criteria rightly go beyond other approaches to assessing resilience, that we do want you to also look at your impact on the broader environment or system, ecosystem that you're operating within, impact on people in that system, etc. So we'll come on to that when we come to the criteria, but I think that is something quite important to bring out, that there is an external focus to it too. Before we go though, one last thing on the previous slide. So the other type of activities here is activities which enable adaptation in other economic activities. So some really, really sort of more obvious examples here would be, say, flood defences. Put flood defences, it's not this simple, but if you put flood defences around a city, you're actually enabling all those activities within the city to be protected and continue. So this is more where the primary intention of those activities is to enable something else to happen. Whereas the adapted economic activity has got a primary intention, which is its basic raison d'etre, power, water, food, transport, whatever. And so the resilience is making sure that is protected. The enabling ones are really geared towards system resilience and protecting other economic activities as a result of that. So yeah, so flood defences, maybe desalination plants, those kind of things which are delivering resilience benefits as their main objective.
So the Dutch government's sovereign green bond, for example, which is a certified climate bond, which went to fund coastal protection measures in the context of climate change, is the sort of thing you mean here?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Cinzia, you're going to take us through some of the screening criteria and give us a bit more detail.
So I think the discussion that we had will make this description quite easy, quite a lot easier actually. So for adapted activities, so the activities that have adopted improvements, adjustments to be able to cope with future climate, there are three main screening criteria. They are qualitative screening criteria, so there are no thresholds. It's all about reducing material, physical risks to the actual activity itself. And the criteria require a good assessment of those risks based on current weather, but also future climate. And that's absolutely key, because this is based on the understanding that really historical data does not represent the future any longer. And there is a need to really look at how the climate, the key climatic parameters for a type of investment may change over the economic life of the investment itself.
I mean, this is really the fundamental issue, isn't it? The past is no guide to the future now.
This is adaptation. This is what adaptation is really all about, is really understanding how changes in the climate may affect you over the years to come. And that's why adaptation is so difficult compared to mitigation, because it requires a bit of a technical input. This is highly technical stuff. It requires looking at climate projections generated by highly sophisticated models, and then downscaling them to an area that is meaningful for the investment that you're looking at, trying to understand, therefore, how certain parameters like temperature, sea level, solar radiation, wind, storms, typhoons, cyclones, etc., and droughts, floods, etc., may change over the lifetime of the investment.
But our predictive capacity, though, now is extraordinary compared to what it was 10 or 20 years ago, isn't it? I mean, I'm hearing now of retail banks who are taking physical risk data, washing it across their portfolio of commercial loans, and identifying those that are at risk of different kinds, and then looking to what the people who they lent money to can do to mitigate that risk, which is exactly what we see everyone to do, right? But this data is actually available now, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is the good news, Sean. The good news is that data is or other types of climate hazards for free on the web. This was unthinkable, 10 years ago, for example. So that's the good news. The good news is that data is there, it's much more readily available. There's a wider range of expertise around the world that understand how to use the data, how to interpret it, really for decision-making purposes. The bad news is that it can be still, and we see this in our operations in the European Investment Bank, it can still be a lengthy process. It can still be quite costly. So it adds an additional layer of due diligence, basically, to a project. And it does require highly specialized technical input that may not be readily available in all sectors. Okay, so it has to be brought in through external experts. So it's the process is still difficult, and doing adaptation and doing right remains quite complex. But it's possible. We do it all the time in all sectors, whether it is water supply and sanitation, wastewater treatment, electricity distribution, power generation, transport, so roads, railways, ports. We do it in all sectors. There is no excuse.
And this is going to be, again, to stress the point, this is about ensuring the financial viability of these investments as well. We have the huge dam in Brazil at the moment where we've seen a shortage of rainfall in the catchment area as a result of climate change, it would seem. The dam has been stopping releasing water downstream with significant negative impact on farmers and riverine systems, entirely unexpected and unpredicted according to the dam owners. But clearly the adaptation models weren't actually used there. And now a dam has got a license to operate problem because voters downstream are furious at the impact of their ecosystem. We can avoid these with the appropriate kind of planning, right? These are the things that we can address by getting it right up front.
Yeah, and I'll make another point that it's quite central to the taxonomy, as well as any work on adaptation, really, that there's always been this understanding that adaptation resilience is really to do with the natural resources, which in a vast majority of cases it really is. It's absolutely crucial that in sector like water and agriculture, we look at resilience. It's fundamental, but it's not just that. This is crucial for infrastructure too. And I'm talking about critical infrastructure, I'm talking about energy and transport and water. It is absolutely crucial, especially I would say now, even more than before, as we come to invest trillions of dollars in infrastructure, especially to support the shift and the transition to a low carbon development pathway. We can't afford to get it wrong. We must get it right. And this is why the taxonomy introduced also the no significant harm principles, which include adaptation. And we'll come to that later on. So going back, sorry, I'm also looking at the comments and the questions. I like to say hello to Pooja. This is a friend from Asia. It's lovely to see that she is connected. Hello, Pooja. Okay, so risk assessment is a fundamental, incredibly important criterion of this taxonomy. The second one is what Anna mentioned earlier, is the idea of looking at the system of how your operation fits within a broader context. So it's not just about the simple project, the simple asset, or the simple corporate, but it's also about how these operations fit in within a broader context, where they are situated, what services they are meant to provide, to whom, and how their adaptation may affect the ability of others to adapt as well. And for that, it's a very simple criteria, and it's to do really to ensure that whatever you do fits within a broader vision of resilience, whether it is a strategy, an action plan, a city plan, a sector plan, whatever it might be. But there is a requirement on the actor to look at what understanding is in that system of resilience and how their operation fits into that. And again, it's based on the assumption of a long-term, forward-looking vision, really. So that's the second criteria. And the third criteria, this is very complex as well. This is to do with monitoring. And when it comes to monitoring in the world of adaptation and resilience, people, already get a little bit nervous. And it's because it's relatively new, not very new, but relatively new. The third criteria, therefore, is to do with ensuring that we are able to measure progress towards resilience. If you want to call your financing sustainable, I think you should be able to do that. You should be able to demonstrate that whatever you're doing is really contributing to some level of adaptation. So it's about you really identifying and adopting indicators that allow you to do that. And traditionally, these indicators try to measure either reduce losses, reduce damages, because of the improvements, the adjustments you made to deal with future climate, or increase parameters, for example, increase availability or access to water, or increase availability or increase security of certain services like electricity and so on and so forth. So they try to capture, and these indicators try to capture really these changes, okay? And we do recognize, I think Anna remembers probably very well the lengthy discussions that we had on this particular criteria in the tech, because it is quite complex. It's not something that there's a huge experience of. But we, as the tech, are tried to provide a little bit of light in the experience that is available there, and it's in the report itself. Actually, at the very end of the long annex, you'll find some examples of indicators.
Now, I've got to quickly switch to Anna here and say complexity again. What are those basics again? We've just got to examine. Because when you get into the weeds, it gets hard, right?
Exactly. The idea of what you're doing is simple. Look for your risks, see what your hazards are, what you're exposed and vulnerable to, where you might impact on other people's resilience, and deal with those in a flexible way over the long-term life of the asset. Is the high-level picture here? Yeah.
And I would suggest that our primary objective with the taxonomy in this measure is to get this ball rolling when, frankly, it isn't rolling in most parts of the world. So that's the key thing. We start examining everything. and addressing it. The detail of requirements, as you say, it's a process approach. We're providing guidance here, but at the end of the day, you just have to go through the process and have a reasonable quality of process. That's right. You're probably going to need a consultant depending on how big your investment is, or a specialist like Cinzia, if you're lucky enough to be the European Investment Bank. But that's the key point to make, isn't it? Right. So just do it. Find a way to do it. Don't panic about getting everything right at this stage, because it is moving science. Is that right, Cinzia?
That's right, and in fact, that's also one of the central elements of the taxonomy. We talk about best effort basis. It's understood that there are uncertainties associated with other climate data. It's understood that some of these requirements may be based on little experience around the world, and they are quite groundbreaking that way. But there is the flexibility built in the taxonomy to do this, to do it right, to do the best of your abilities, and that's really what matters, I guess.
Okay.
So we can move on to maybe the next slide, which is, I suppose, quite important too, and it's about in what to count. So what's really eligible as sustainable finance when you adapt your operation. And in this case, really, it's only the expenditure, and often this of the adaptation measure. So the expenditure associated with your adjustments or improvements, the changes that you made in operations to adapt it and ensure that it performs well, even under a changing climate. And often this is a small part of a larger operation. In many infrastructure projects, for example, it can be as small as 5, 10, 20% perhaps, and not very often. Okay, but that's what it is. What's sustainable finance is that the cost associated with the adaptation measures adopted in that operation. Okay, let's move on to the other set of activities that contribute to adaptation. These are the enabling activity. And this is a really exciting stuff, I think, because it gives us the opportunity to create a bit of demand for this type of products and services that can really help other actors around the world to adapt. And there are some examples on the slide for the participants that can see. But basically, these are things like, for example, anything to do with climate analytics. So understanding the data, processing the data, or even collecting the data. And we do, in the European Investment Bank, quite a few investments on this, on oceanic vessels, try to gather data on how temperatures change in the oceans over the course of the years. And this data is then used by modelers to model the future, basically. Or other things could be, for example, research and development in crops that are resistant to extreme weather. And there's quite a lot of that going on. I mean, there's always been historically, especially in some large corporates, but there's quite a lot of work done on drought-resistant crops, flood-resistant crops. And this is very important to support productivity in agriculture.
This is going to be incredibly important. I've heard stories that maize will no longer be able to be grown, the maize we know, in parts of Mexico. God forgive, what would Mexico do without maize, for example? So this becomes a really important thing to do. But I'm very curious about the first one. If you're a municipal issuer, for example, does that mean that all your fire and emergency services can be included in your sustainable pool for green bond issuance? Is that what you're saying?
No, sorry. No, what I mean is really fire and other emergency services for water-related disasters. And I mean, unfortunately, I would say, unfortunately.
Okay. So what is it? Give me a flavor.
Quite a large portion of the municipality operations anyway. Mm-hmm. Think of southern France and the increased risk of wildfire every year. I mean, if you want to stay around the corner in Europe or in other parts of the world, unfortunately, these types of investments will need to increase substantially because of the increase in the risk of wildfire, for example, and associated vulnerabilities to it. So no, what I mean is really dedicated services. There has to be a link to vulnerability to climate change. In fact, this is one of the criteria. We can have a look at them if we move on to the
as a caveat to that, though, when we get more environmental and social goals in the taxonomy, I think a lot of those, when we get more environmental and social goals in the taxonomy, all those other emergency services that link to health, etc. I'm just saying, it's not like it's just because we've got an adaptation focus here, but we recognise they give value, but they'll give value under other environmental and social objectives as we develop criteria for those. So in time, I think they will all be eligible, but not under adaptation. Yeah,
and that is a good point for our listeners. That we are intending to do further work on the taxonomy. In Europe, we will be looking at circular economy, pollution, marine issues next year. But the intent is also, over time, to look at a variety of social issues, especially linking to the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, what we're learning right now is that resilience around our societies and our economies and ecosystems is not tomorrow's problem, it's today's problem. So we've got to hasten our work in this area, and understanding what are the right kind of health investments, social support and emergency services to create a society that's more resilient is actually part of our intellectual work now going forward. So this is not a 10-year job, folks. This is something we've got to start tackling now, and we do intend to. But we're not there yet. This is the starting point, taxonomy. So Cinzia, keep going.
It might be of interest just to go through the criteria for enabling activities. And the criteria are very much based on the understanding that these type of activities are technology, products, services that are meant to remove barriers of any type, whether they're information barriers or financial barriers or technological barriers, and so on and so forth. They tend to be that sort of activity, as we said. The requirements are centered around the idea of demonstrating that your activity, if it's an enabling activity, can support others to adapt. So it's all about that. You must demonstrate that what you're claiming to be an enabling activity really enables. So who does it enable, and to what type of risk will this activity help others to adapt? So it's all about that. There's also another caveat, which is if it is an infrastructure type of enabling activity, then you still have to, I'm afraid, also meet the criteria for adapted activities. So this applies to things like flood protection, for example. Really, if you're saying, your activity enables a city to operate because you are protecting the whole city from certain type, from sea level rise and storm surge, then you need to make sure that flood protection is built to also withstand future changes. So it's adapted itself.
And you see some people doing interesting work. I know where I lived for many years in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, the Railway Authority has done a really good adaptation plan. They started off just looking at coastal protection issues because they're discovering those railways and very low-lying land near the sea that were getting flooded by waves. And so they've now just taken steps to mitigate that risk and ensure that you don't have outages in the railway line. There's so much to be done in so many areas, but there are actually people working on this. We do have a lot of good work happening around the world. It's important to note. It's not entirely greenfield, right?
No, not at all. And you mentioned, cities have been at the forefront of working on adaptation and resilience, for example, for obvious reasons, because of the high concentration of people, businesses. They play an absolutely central role to any economy, and therefore they need to deal with the negative effects of climate change. So there are loads of cities that have already, New York, that there's several initiatives that can be looked at to really get a sense of what others are doing. But there are also industry associations that are really looking at how to deal with adaptation and resilience, more specifically in the sector, and this has been going on for quite a few years already. So no, this is not it's not new work. This experience that we can build upon. But the beauty of the taxonomy is that really bringing that clarity, finally, that common language as to what we mean by adaptation once and for all, so that we're all clear, what we need to work towards. And that's the novelty. That's new.
We're running out of time. This should be a 4-hour webinar, not a 1-hour webinar, unfortunately.
Quite.
But we
Okay,
had
so I'll try to be fast through the next few points I like to make. And next point is, so in the case of an enabling activity, what can you count? And clearly you can count it all, basically, all expenditure or revenues linked to that enabling activity. So, for example, if you're talking about investments in crops that can resist to increased risk of drought or flood, all that investment in that particular dedicated R&D can be counted as sustainable finance. Okay, so the taxonomy doesn't tell you whether any particular economic activity is either type 1 or type 2. So whether it's an adapted activity or is an enabling activity, that's down to the actor to demonstrate whether it's one or the other. And this is because there are some activities clearly that can be either, a lot depends on the intention upon which the activity is predicated, and therefore really is down to the actor to demonstrate whether it's one, whether it's just about adapting your activity or whether you're really developing something new or something that can help others to adapt through an enabling activity. And I think that's, yeah, oh no, that's not all, no, sorry.
Please keep going.
There's one more point to make, and this is very important. This is not a small point at all, and it's to do with do no significant harm to adaptation. So the taxonomy at the moment covers 2 environmental objectives, as Anna mentioned at the beginning, mitigation and adaptation. So the way the taxonomy is constructed is that if you contribute substantially to one environmental objective, you also have to demonstrate that you're not harming all the other environmental objectives. So there are criteria also for the do no significant harm to adaptation. And so that we are clear what we mean here. If you're building a wind farm, so an activity that clearly contributes to low carbon objectives, you also need to ensure that that wind farm is adapted to a future climate. So cause no harm to adaptation by demonstrating that it's been designed, built, maintained, operated in order to perform well also under a changing climate. That's what the do no significant harm to adaptation is. And this is wonderful. I think this is really powerful, Sean, because it basically means whatever you do also on mitigation and in the future, and any other really operation that contribute to an environmental objective, you still need to make it resilient. You still need to ensure that what you do is there, is built properly, is built thinking of the future, and is going to perform well.
I mean, in a sense, it's common sense. I mean, you don't want to build a railway in an area that's going to get hotter without the right tensile strength steel to make sure it doesn't buckle, because railway lines do buckle in high heat if it's not the right steel. It's simple, right?
It is absolutely common sense, but
doing it's another matter.
Yeah, and we felt this was absolutely crucial because, contrary to what one might think, as we were saying earlier, regulations is not there yet. Yeah. This is not common practice. This is not what's happening every day yet. We're really not there yet. So we needed to put that additional, let's say, safeguard or additional requirement to make sure that all our efforts towards a better world, a low carbon, more environmentally friendly, more sustainable world, don't get washed away, literally.
We've had a few questions about available tools to do assessment, both geodata coded tools, or maybe what SMEs can get. I mean, is this as simple as people typing in adaptation tools? What can we say to people where to go to look for? Is there something that the ERB does in this area?
Yes, there are several tools available. It depends, of course, the type of tool you might want to choose. Depends on the type of operations you run. So, for example, in the European Investment Bank, we have a customized screening tool is highly sophisticated because we do operations in all sectors and all scales, really, and around the globe. And the tool allows us to really identify risks to our operations around the world. It's a screening tool, and it's available. It's a commercial tool that can be bought. But there are also tools that are freely available on the web, for example, and allow you to pinpoint the location and understand what the key risks are in terms of maybe the next 20, 30, 50 years even. And they are fed through quite robust climate data these days. You can also look at data, if you are willing to do that. That is not, let's say, filtered through a tool. And there's plenty. I mean, in the UK, you have the wonderful UK Met Office, which is centers of excellence for climate data, or NASA years ago under Obama released all the climate data, and that's freely available as well. There are several research centers that also make their climate model experiments available. So there are different things, and some of them are free, some of them are commercially available. But it very much depends on your operations. If you're a small SME, you certainly don't want to spend a huge amount of money in a very sophisticated tool, also because you might not need it really, and you might just want to perhaps use the expertise of a consultant, let's say, to understand how your activities may be really affected by climate, and devise your own policy on how to deal with that. If you're a large bank, perhaps you want to take a much more systematic approach really to identify risks. So there is a spectrum of options there. And we, as part of our work, advise our clients which way to go, for the clients that really want to build their internal capacity to be able to deal with physical climate risks.
I think one of the features of the last 10 years has also been the rise of a whole lot of specialist consultancies and data providers of different sorts. We've seen people like 427 in the US, or Acclimatise in the UK, or XDI in Australia, and so on. There's quite a few of these. What I found interesting in the last couple of years has been rating agencies starting to buy up these. So 427 got taken over by Moody's, and now Moody's is looking, as they should, at the credit ratings using these kinds of adaptation scenario planning tools. And that's where we've got to get to, that this will come up and is already being integrated. S&P and Moody's have spoken publicly about that at seminars of us, about how they're starting to look at valuing, or rather giving a credit rating, I should say, which is directly influenced by the capacity of the institution to pay, depending on how much they've properly addressed forward risk, right? Common sense, but it's beginning to appear in the tools. We need to start wrapping up. There's been a whole lot of questions. We had just a couple of more first. In terms of the bringing this into accounting standards, so an interesting question someone asked, you talked about engineering criteria. Is there also some move for us to start looking at, when we're accounting value, for example, that these issues can be brought up, or is this like too hard for where we are at the moment? And the specific question was about the green accounting standards, the discussion that's happening in the mitigation area a lot.
I don't think we are far from that, really, in the sense that there is an attempt to look at how the physical risk can be taken into account also in accounting exercises. You mentioned value at risk, for example, and this is an area that many commercial banks already have looked into, and also central banks, of course, looking at their portfolio and trying to understand how their clients and their portfolio may be a risk because of both really physical and transition risk. So there's quite a lot of work around the world being undertaken on that. Of course, they tend to be the big actors involved in this type of exercise, and perhaps this for the small actors is a bit harder, mainly because, again, of the complexity and the data requirements and so on and so forth. So that's what I would say. We're certainly doing that in the bank, really looking at how transition and physical risk may affect us, may affect our portfolio, may affect our clients, with the intention as a public bank to really help the clients that may be at risk because of potentially stranded assets or of the risk that climate may affect directly their operations.
So, Anna, in this recovery period, COVID recovery, how do we draw the link between what we've got in the taxonomy and the sort of things that governments are having to address to recover the economy? Is there anything we can do at this stage because we don't have guidelines? It's still something work? There was a question about this. How does this link to the COVID recovery?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's a complex area. But in a sense, what this does, and these initiatives which are really looking at assessing and addressing physical climate risks, what it doesn't do is go on to say what's the impacts on that on people's economic outcomes, or even where they can live, etc. So we haven't gone to the next stage of saying we can evaluate your impacts in terms of impacts on social, cultural, economic dimensions. So that would be a logical extension of this work in that sense. And I think that really then gets to how do these climate change risks, physical climate change risks, impact on your resilience in all sorts of other ways. At the moment, it's a bit physical risks to physical impacts, but it would be an extension. It could be an extension, say, physical risks to physical impacts and social impacts and economic impacts. So that's one route that we do need to get to. And the other one is really what are the, not just the physical climate change risks, but the other risks. So, and it's connected to climate change. So like you said at the beginning, the likelihood of pandemics. So really what are the key risks to resilience that we need to be assessing? One of them is physical climate change risks, but what are the other critical risks that we want to have similar methodologies to get people to start thinking about and making sure that they're supporting them and not undermining responses to those risks or trying to prevent them getting out of control in the first place, essentially. So I think this provides the structure and the framework to build on in multiple dimensions to bring it into what is actually quite a very complex space to unpack resilience to all sorts of different risks by all sorts of, it's a many to many kind of relationship, but this is a kind of core that we can build out from to those other network and matrix of impacts and relationships.
Cinzia, thank you, Anna. That was great. Cinzia, parting thoughts for our listeners. What should they take away? What's a key message to take away from all of this?
I think the key message from my perspective really is that it is possible, it is doable, we all have to do it. Get geared up to make sure that your operations are resilient, whatever is your business, whatever is your area of work, it can be done. The European Investment Bank, of course, helps a number of clients to do so, but yes, time is up. Really get the head out of the sand and get to really work out on this.
Hey, Anna, any final words?
No, just to echo Cinzia, I think the time is up because the climate time is up. These situations are only going to get worse, but also the policy time is up. The fact that this is in the EU taxonomy and it has equal prominence with other environmental goals, and not just in this arena and this agenda either, but it's really up there. So there's a big push, there's TCFD, there's a lot of other things that are really pushing everybody to address their resilience issues and impacts. So yeah, the tide has already turned effectively. So this is the support network. And like Cinzia says, a lot of people are already doing this and the tools are emerging. So for some people it's new, but let's look around, build the networks, build the information channels to help other people who are starting to do it now to be able to do that, because those resources are there to get you going. Yeah. So
it can be complex, but the principle is simple. You need to review and you need to act. That's fundamentally it. Just show evidence about what you've done. Let other people assess. Get going is the main thing, and we'll develop this as we go. Everyone needs to be thinking about this. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Cinzia, for spending your time today. You can see on the screen the download for the full report, all 700 pages of it in 2 volumes about the taxonomy. You can get this particular webinar and all other webinars in the taxonomy series from climatebonds.net/webinars. You can get it in podcast afterwards too. Please do join us next week for our transport criteria webinar at the same time, 1500 Paris time on Thursday. We will attempt to answer some of your questions by email. Thank you for people for asking them. And if you're concerned about all the other topics around this area, there's a hell of a lot of information around. So start searching on Google for adaptation resilience. It's amazing what you'll find. Luckily, in the last 10 years, thanks to the work of people like Cinzia and Anna, we've grown an industry and there are support mechanisms out there. Thank you everyone for being part of this series and for your enthusiasm and interest in creating a sustainable future, a future fit for our children. Over and out.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having us. Bye.